Have you ever thought that the feeling of lack inside you comes from not yet having what you desire? You want a clear relationship. You want to be the one who is chosen. You want to be loved without constantly feeling anxious about losing it. And when those desires are not met, the way you show up in relationships begins to change. Carl Jung, the great psychological thinker of the 20th century, believed that people are not drawn to pleading. They are drawn to psychological wholeness. When you pursue someone to be chosen, some part of you may be seeking validation rather than standing firmly within yourself. This does not mean you are not worthy, not because you are less fortunate, and not because fate has been harsher with you, but when you try to prove your value, you unintentionally send the message that this value is missing. Love is not outside this law. This sense of lack gradually drives people to chase, and the more you chase something, the further it moves away. In today's video, I will guide you through 7 layers of inner transformation, not to teach you how to love, but to help you see why stopping the chase can completely change the way you are loved. Pay special attention to the 5th layer. Many people stop there, believing they have succeeded, while inside, an old movement has not truly stopped. 1. Recognize the loop. Some things in life don't repeat in the same form, but they return through the same feeling. A person can change environments, change partners, change choices, but if the inner state hasn't been seen, it will usually reappear. And often, when it returns, it's not easy to recognize right away. You meet someone new, begin again, and believe this time will be different. And for a while, things truly are fine, until a very small moment arrives when you notice yourself starting to wait, starting to pay closer attention, feeling slightly tense, not tense in an obvious, anxious way, just not as relaxed as before. That feeling isn't new. It has shown up before. Maybe everything began normally. The conversation flowed naturally, with no warning signs. You check your phone once more. Then, again. There's no new notification. You tell yourself you're just looking casually, that you don't really care. But somewhere in your mind, familiar thoughts begin to pass through. What are they doing? Maybe they're busy. Maybe they haven't seen the message. Or perhaps, did I say something wrong? You work, but now and then you wonder if they've replied. You talk to someone else, but part of your attention is still listening for your phone. The waiting doesn't arrive like a wave of intense anxiety. It comes more quietly than that. A very familiar kind of waiting. Waiting for a response to know you're still remembered. Waiting for a small sign to confirm the relationship hasn't drifted away. And you don't call this insecurity. You call it caring. You don't feel like you're doing anything wrong. On the contrary, you feel like you're trying, listening more, holding back more, adjusting yourself so nothing goes wrong. Everything looks like maturity. But beneath all these reasonable efforts, a very familiar feeling is still quietly operating. That feeling is not new. It has appeared before, in other relationships. Maybe different people, different circumstances, different beginnings. But when you touch it, you realize it has the same shape. A very light tightness in the chest. A vague sense of anticipation. A feeling that you're leaning towards someone more than necessary. You may remember a time when you believed this time would be different. This person is more special. This relationship has more depth, and you yourself feel more grown, more aware than before. On some level, that may be true. But if you listen closely, the inner feeling still carries the same familiar rhythm, the same old tone. There is a very small moment when this reveals itself. Or you tell yourself that this time you will not wait anymore, will not care as much, will let things unfold more naturally. You believe you have learned your lesson, that you will not repeat the old reflexes. But then all it takes is a silence that lasts longer than usual, a message that does not arrive at the right moment, and you realize you are standing in the same familiar place, not because you are weak, and not because you lack understanding, but because that is the way you once learned to hold on to connection, the way you once used so you would not fall out, not be left behind. Carl Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." When placing this statement into that experience, something becomes clearer. It is not the situation that is repeating, even if the context changes. It is not exactly the other person, even if the face is different. What returns is the feeling inside you, the same familiar tension, the same old reflex. And only when that feeling is seen does the loop begin to reveal itself, no longer hiding under the name of coincidence or fate. Imagine a girl. She has loved a few people. The first was quiet, hard to read. The second was more attentive, but disappeared exactly when she needed him most. The third was more proactive, yet still made her wait, guess, and adjust herself so she wouldn't ruin the relationship. On the surface, they are very different, but the feeling she lives with them is identical. Each time, she is the one who pays more attention. She thinks more. She is the one holding the rhythm, holding the silence, holding the hope. And at some point, she begins to realize it's not that she's loving the same kind of people, but that she's stepping into the same familiar inner state, just with different faces, at a very primitive level of awareness. Human beings once learned that in order to stay, they had to do something. They had to try a little harder, be more visibly present, and adjust themselves so they would not be excluded. That lesson was formed very early, sometimes from the very first relationships in life, and it quietly follows you without needing to be named. You carry it into relationships that do not require you to sacrifice yourself, yet the reflex still activates automatically. And then, to legitimize that familiar feeling, your mind will naturally believe that this person is more special, that this relationship has more potential, that this time you are more aware, more understanding, more in control of the situation. Those stories help you remain in the old state without having to ask difficult questions. But if this is not the first time you have lived inside this feeling, if that familiar tension keeps returning in different forms, then perhaps the issue is no longer in the other person. Perhaps something deeper within you is truly repeating, waiting to be seen. 2. Break the hidden belief. People rarely act because of what they say out loud. Most of the time, we act because of what we believe, even when that belief has never been acknowledged. You may say that you love freedom, that you do not want to depend on anyone, and that you are mature enough. But the way you wait, the way you react, the way you adjust yourself, is telling a different story. The assumptions you live by but rarely put into words, they operate quietly, like the background rules of a game you do not remember ever agreeing to. That is the unspoken belief. An unspoken belief usually does not appear as a clear statement. It does not say, "I am not good enough." It simply shows up silently in very small choices. In the way, you are the one who texts first one more time. In the way you lower your own needs to keep the peace. In the way you accept less than what you need, and then call it understanding. These thoughts sound very familiar. I should try a little harder. Maybe I am not important enough. If I am not proactive, everything will drift away. They do not sound like harsh self-blame. They appear very reasonable, very human. Sometimes they are even praised as maturity, as being considerate of others. You do not see these thoughts as a problem because they are not loud. They simply make you begin to give a little more space to the other person's feelings and step a little further away from your own. You think a bit longer before speaking, hesitate more before reacting, and adjust yourself more so that things do not get worse. Gradually, your attention is no longer on how you are feeling, but on where the other person stands in this relationship. And you call that shift love. There are moments when you suddenly notice your body reacting just because of a stretch of silence, not because you are immediately afraid of losing them, but because it feels like you just lost a very familiar point of support, a sinking feeling, even though no one has said goodbye. A man goes to work, always takes on extra tasks, always stays late, always says, "Let me handle it." He thinks he is a responsible person, until one day, he realizes, "I am not trying this hard because of the job. I am trying because I believe that if I am not useful, I will not be kept." Carl Jung once wrote, "What you do not make conscious will appear in your life as fate." It may not be the relationship that is deciding your emotions. It may be an old belief quietly guiding the way you attach. I once heard a friend share about his relationship. Every time the two of them argued, he was always the one who texted first. Not because he thought he was completely wrong, but because he could not stand the feeling of prolonged silence. He said that in those moments, there were no complicated thoughts in his head. There was only a very familiar urge. If I do not do something, everything will slip away. So he explained more, softened his tone, took the blame onto himself, even when he was not sure it was actually his fault. Later, when he looked back, he realized that what made him rush was not the fear of losing her. It was a deeper fear that if he did not soothe this tension, if he did not show himself as necessary, he would no longer have a place in that relationship. The key moment is not when you realize the other person is not right for you. It is when you suddenly see that you are afraid of something else. Not exactly afraid of losing them, but afraid of losing the feeling of being chosen, being needed, being prioritized, afraid of returning to a familiar position where you have to ask yourself where your value lies if there is no one else's gaze on you. Unspoken beliefs are often formed very early, maybe from your first relationships, maybe from the ways you once had to try hard just to be noticed, maybe from the times you learned that if you did not do something, you would be left behind. That belief is not loud. It simply and quietly teaches you one thing: to stay, you must prove yourself. And then, you carry that lesson into your present relationships. Even when the other person does not ask you to sacrifice yourself. Even when no one says that you are not enough. The unspoken belief still makes you act as if that were true. The important thing is, you do not break this belief by resisting it. You cannot just tell yourself to think differently and expect everything to change. Because the unspoken belief does not live at the level of reason. It lives in reflexes, in feelings, in what you do before you have time to think. That belief only begins to loosen when you see it. When you realize that there are times you are not pursuing out of love, but out of a need for validation. Not because the other person is so special, but because the feeling of being chosen is so familiar. And that very familiarity is what is holding you in place. This recognition does not bring immediate freedom. It only creates a very small crack. But light often begins to enter through cracks like that. When you can see the belief operating, it is no longer completely invisible. Perhaps you have been in that state before, and if that pursuit does not come from love, then very likely you are trying to prove something about yourself. 3. Turn the mirror inward. We often look at the other person's reactions to know where we stand. What does their silence mean? Are they pulling away because we are not enough? Those questions arise almost reflexively, and for a long time, you believe that is the only way to understand a relationship. Yet there is a very small moment when this begins to shift, when, instead of asking what is happening with them, you suddenly notice what is arising within me right then. No fixing, no explaining, no need to rationalize. Just clearly see the feeling that is present. It is a very subtle shift in perspective, but enough to change the entire experience. It is the moment you stop using other people as mirrors for your emotions and begin turning your gaze toward where the feeling actually arises. Carl Jung once wrote, "Who looks outside, dreams. Who looks inside, awakens." This line does not ask you to turn your back on the world. It simply suggests that there is another direction of looking, where you do not need additional data from the outside to understand what is happening. The awakening here is not about understanding everything, but about beginning to clearly see your own reactions in the moment they occur. When you no longer fully believe the problem lies with the other person, but you are not yet ready to say it lies with you either. Just a light sense of doubt. When the same feeling returns across many relationships, many situations, you begin to realize that circumstances may change, but your inner reactions do not. And that very moment of doubt opens another door, quieter, less dramatic. Before, your mind was used to running after other people's movements. You were used to reacting to them, rather than starting from yourself. You thought that every small change from the other person was a sign of your own value, whether you were still chosen, still important. But if you pause for a moment, you will notice something else. the instant silence appears. There is also a very quick reaction within you. Your chest tightens slightly. Your mind starts thinking more. You feel uneasy, restless, even though nothing clear has happened yet. The distance is not truly large, but the feeling of loss has already arrived. When you stop tracking others, emotions that were once covered by analysis begin to show themselves. A vague anxiety, a nameless sense of anticipation, a very old fear of being left behind. These emotions cannot be solved. They simply appear when you are no longer busy, avoiding them by speculating about someone else. You may realize that what tightens you is not the silence, but the feeling that you are losing your place. Not the other person's words, but the fear that you are no longer chosen. When you stop thinking about what the other person is thinking, you see that the issue is not as complicated as you imagined. Inside you, there is only a very familiar feeling, a feeling of lack, a feeling of being afraid of being left out. It does not appear because of this person, but because it was already there. I once received a confession from a close friend after her relationship ended. Honestly, I did not think they would break up. From the outside, everything seemed fine. They did not have big fights, no betrayal, no obvious event to call a collapse, until she told me about a very small moment. One evening, the two of them sat next to each other, and nothing special was happening. She stayed quiet for a while, not initiating conversation as she usually did, and in that silence, she realized she had begun to panic. Not because she was immediately afraid of losing him, but because it felt as if she did not keep the rhythm, everything would fall. At that moment, she was no longer thinking about her boyfriend. Not what he was doing, not whether he was right or wrong. What she saw most clearly was a familiar feeling within herself. The sense that she always had to be present, had to be lively enough, interesting enough, for the relationship to continue to exist. After the breakup, she told me, "I realized I was not sad because I lost him. I was sad because I finally saw how long I had been tensing myself. In that moment, there is no demand to change anything, no need to reassure yourself, no need to find a way to be stronger. Just recognizing that the emotion is present. When you are calm enough to see it without rushing to push it away, a very different movement happens. Not control, but a closeness to your own experience. This honesty does not look like a solution. It does not immediately make you feel lighter, but it ends an old habit. The habit of using other people's reactions to decide the value of your own feelings. When you clearly see what you are feeling, you are no longer completely pulled along by the question of what the other person is thinking. If you stay long enough, you may realize that many reactions once called love were actually efforts to avoid facing a deeper sense of emptiness. When the mirror faces outward, that feeling is covered. When the mirror turns inward, it becomes clear and, therefore, less powerful. You do not need to answer right away, nor rush to understand everything. Just remain with that moment, where you no longer cling to other people's reactions to know where you stand. And when you stop tracking others' reactions, stop reading signals from the outside to define yourself, something within you begins to come into clearer view. 4. Face the true motive. There comes a time when you have stayed with your own feelings long enough that familiar questions become difficult to answer in the old ways. They no longer carry the tone of probing or self-soothing. They become more direct and therefore more uncomfortable. You begin to feel a slight unease because the question arising now no longer revolves around the other person, but turns straight toward you. Why am I doing all of this? When you are still thinking, why haven't they replied? What does their silence mean? Do they still care? Your mind is pointed outward. At that point, you have not yet asked yourself. Only when you stop guessing, stop analyzing, stop chasing, do you begin to notice another question surfacing in your mind. You look back at the things you have done and realize you have not always acted out of pure love. There is a deeper reason behind those actions. You were trying not entirely because of the other person, but because you were afraid of being left behind, afraid of no longer being important, afraid you were not enough to be chosen. Here, the boundary between loving and needing becomes fragile. At times, you cannot tell whether you are truly loving or merely clinging out of fear of loss. Texting, caring, listening, yielding. From the outside, it all looks like love. The actions themselves are not wrong. The issue is not what you do. The difference lies in how you feel inside while doing those things. When you act from love, you feel at ease, not tense. And after doing it, you do not feel diminished. And if the other person does not respond right away, you are still okay. But in contrast, when you act from need, your chest tightens slightly. Your mind fills with worry. You wait for a response in order to breathe more easily. And after doing it, you feel tired, depleted, and easily irritated. On the surface, these two look very similar. You text consistently, you listen, you yield, you stay. But when you observe more closely, you can sense the subtle difference inside. Love carries expansion, need carries contraction. Love comes from fullness, need comes from fear of loss. What matters is that you do not need to conclude what is right or wrong. You only need to recognize that both of these motives have existed within you, sometimes in parallel, sometimes taking turns steering. And many relationships grow exhausting, not because of a lack of love, but because the needing part has been covered up too carefully, for too long. There is a couple in love. When they step into relationships with both families, the girl begins to change. She tries to speak more tactfully, be more patient, and please more people. On the outside, that looks like maturity. But inside, every time she is criticized or met with silence, she tightens up, afraid she is not good enough to be accepted. At that point, what she is doing is no longer entirely out of love, but out of the need to be kept in this relationship. And that very motive exhausts her, not because the family is difficult, but because she is carrying too much in order not to be excluded. Have you ever been in such a situation? When the ego is hurt, it tries to patch itself with recognition from the outside. It wants to be chosen to feel valuable. It wants to be kept to avoid touching a very old emptiness. And so, you begin to do more, wait more, adjust yourself more. On the outside, it looks like devotion. Inside, it is a fear quietly leading the way. Carl Jung believed, every form of excessive desire stems from an ego that has not been reconciled. That statement is not meant to judge you. It simply names the feeling that has just surfaced. That excessive longing is not a sign of weakness. It is a sign that there is a part within you that has never been fully faced. When you recognize this truth, you see that what makes you tense is not the possibility of losing the other person. What truly panics you is the idea of returning to a state of invisibility, a state of not being seen. That truth is hard to accept because it touches your self-respect. But when it appears, it also brings a very different feeling, a strange kind of relief. The pain at this moment does not come from the truth. It comes from having avoided that truth for so long, maintaining the image of someone who knows how to love, someone tolerant enough, someone who always tries, consumes a great deal of energy. When you no longer have to hide your true motive, both from others and from yourself, a portion of silent tension is released. You may realize that many things that once exhausted you were not actually about the relationship. They lay in the constant effort to prove that you are worthy. When the motive is faced directly, you no longer have to strain to maintain a role. And that very pause creates the first space for a different experience. If so much of your chasing has come from the desire to fill a void, what would happen if you stopped? When you no longer use movement to avoid that empty feeling, what will you face? Often, it is not a collapse, as you once imagined, not an endless void, nor unbearable pain. What appears first is usually very simple. A sense of aloneness, an old sadness you have never sat with. A part of you that has been neglected for too long because you were always busy running toward others. And in that very moment, when there is no one left to chase, no movement left to cling to, you begin to see clearly what you have been avoiding all along. Not other people, but the feeling of being alone with yourself. In the middle of this journey, if you are listening and feel that something is touching you, take that as a very real sign. Perhaps you have just seen a part of yourself. You have come halfway, and the fact that you are still here, listening, staying with your experience, is in itself an important movement. Leave a like or share this video with someone who needs to hear it. See that as a way of marking the moment you touched something real. We truly want you to acknowledge the experience you just had. Before moving on, we want to say thank you. Not because you have watched this far, but because you allowed yourself to pause long enough to look deeper. In each moment like this, change does not happen loudly, but it begins to take shape, and the fact that you choose to stay, to reflect, to listen, is something we deeply appreciate. 5. Stop chasing. Stopping the pursuit at this stage does not appear as a calculated choice or an inner declaration of discipline. It does not come from willpower. It comes after you have looked long enough at your true motive. When the truth has been seen clearly, a very quiet shift occurs. You realize you could still keep running, keep trying, keep maintaining the familiar momentum, but the body begins to respond differently. The effort is no longer smooth. It creates a sense of friction, fatigue, and a loss of rhythm. And that loss of rhythm itself is the sign that an old movement is naturally coming to its endpoint. Pursuing does not exist only in love. It is present in work when you take on more responsibility, not entirely because it fits, but because you are afraid of becoming replaceable. It appears in personal goals when you try to reach an image of success to be recognized, rather than because you truly want to live in that state. It seeps into family life when you hold the role of the stable one, the one who endures, in exchange for the feeling of being needed. In each context, the form is different, but the underlying motive is very similar. It is the desire to be validated that you have value, that your presence means something to someone or something outside of you. There is a pivotal moment. You stand in front of a familiar action, a message that could be sent, an explanation that could be added, a task that could be taken on. You know clearly that you are completely capable of doing it, but something in you no longer lifts. Not out of anger, not out of calculation, and not to test anyone's reaction, simply because the urge is no longer there. This moment usually unfolds very quietly. But if you look closely, you will notice that within that pause, there is a space to breathe that rarely existed before. When the pursuit settles down, silence enters with a different quality. It is no longer a spacey that creates tension, where you must quickly fill it with action. At work, you allow a result that is not yet clearly defined. In relationships, you allow the other person to keep their own rhythm. In personal life, you allow yourself not to need to know the next answer yet. This silence carries space. It does not push you into anxious waiting, but opens the possibility of observation. Think of a girl who is used to keeping harmony in her family. Every time her parents are tense, every time relatives gather, she is the one who speaks gently first, yields first, and explains on behalf of others. She believes that if she is skillful enough, understanding enough, everything will fall into place. But after one time of being so tired she no longer wants to open her mouth, she realizes that what kept her in that position was not entirely love, but the fear of becoming the one who makes the atmosphere heavy. When she begins to stop explaining, stop being the bridge, the family does not collapse as she once feared. The only thing that disappears is the prolonged exhaustion. What remains is a strange space, where for the first time, she is allowed to be a daughter, not the one who keeps the rhythm for everyone. Carl Jung once said, "What you resist persists. What you accept transforms itself." You do not eliminate desire, nor do you try to overcome it through mental effort. You recognize that desire, understand that it once played a protective role, and let it be present without gripping it tightly. When you are no longer pulled along by it, the ego begins to soften. Letting go is not an action, but a consequence of understanding. A common misunderstanding is to think that if you stop, you will lose everything. Lose the relationship, lose the opportunity, lose the position, even lose yourself. But the real experience of many people shows the opposite. What is left in this stage is usually not what is essential. What is left is the prolonged exhaustion, the feeling of having to constantly prove yourself. What remains is often quieter, but more real. At work, you keep the part of your contribution that truly fits your capacity. In love, you keep a presence that is not strained. In life goals, you keep your own breathing rhythm. When the momentum of pursuit stops, a space appears. This space is different from the emptiness that once made you panic. Before, schedules, expectations, and other people's reactions always filled your inner space. Now, as those elements settle down, you face a region that has never been touched. Here, there is nothing you need to do immediately, nothing you need to prove. This space is foundational, creating the conditions for you to feel yourself as an independent being. In that space, many people encounter old feelings again. A slight sense of being lost, a sadness that was once overlooked, a part of you that was never noticed because you were always busy turning outward. These feelings do not demand to be fixed or changed. They only need to be seen. When you stay long enough, you realize you are still standing. There is no collapse, no endless void, only a fresh presence where you begin to get acquainted with yourself without needing to go through anyone else. In work, stopping the pursuit shows when you work from inner alignment rather than from the gaze of others. You choose a pace that can be sustained over the long term. With personal goals, it appears that when you allow the goal to change shape according to who you are now, you still move forward. But the direction is no longer pulled by the fear of falling behind. This progress may be slower, but far less draining. A director is used to always going ahead, always pushing the pace, always controlling. On the surface, it looks like responsibility, but at one point, he realizes he is no longer doing it for the work, but out of fear of being seen as losing his edge. When that motive is exposed, he makes no big decision, only stops at one very small thing. No longer pushing, no longer pursuing an objective that had already drained his energy. And that very pause reveals another truth about himself. When you stop pursuing, when the old momentum settles down, something begins to be felt more clearly within you. Lightness, emptiness, or a kind of peace that has never been named. The answer does not need to appear immediately. It will gradually take shape as you continue to stay in the state that has just opened. If you have ever gone through such a moment of stopping, in love, work, or a life decision, you can share your experience in the comments. There is no need for a complete story, just one real moment where you chose not to betray yourself. Those stories create a shared space where each person realizes that this 6. A new state. After you stop pursuing, nothing explosive happens. There is no moment of triumph, no feeling as if you have just crossed some important milestone. Things do not instantly settle, nor do they become clearer in the way you once imagined. The new state appears very quietly, so quietly that many people pass through it without even noticing. It is not emptiness, but it cannot yet be called fullness. It is like an in-between zone, where inside you there is less noise, less tension, as if the invisible string that used to tug you toward others has loosened. You no longer feel that you have to orient outward to find something to lean on. Not because you have found the answer, but because the question no longer presses the way it used to. Everything is still there. Relationships, work, familiar responsibilities. The only difference is that they no longer pull you with the same force. You begin to sense your own rhythm, even if it is still fragile. Mornings begin a little differently. You still wake up to things that need to be done, to familiar schedules, to obligations that have not disappeared. But there is no longer the feeling that something is missing and must be filled immediately. You no longer feel you have to move faster, to prove yourself, to keep pace with someone out there. A space to breathe appears between you and the new day. Not large, not dramatic, but enough for you to realize you are present, standing here, in your own life, without needing to run anywhere at all. In the past, silence used to make you tense. A message left unanswered for too long could throw off your focus for an entire morning. A call not picked up right away would open a series of guesses in your mind, from very few possibilities to scenarios that made your chest tighten. Back then, Silence was not merely the absence of sound. It carried the meaning of danger. It signaled loss, the possibility that you were slipping out of your familiar place in someone's life. Silence used to be a signal that made you act, check, or do something to reassure yourself. In the new state, silence no longer functions as a warning. It no longer demands that you decode or fill it. It is simply silence. No added meaning, no story attached. You realize the world continues to operate even without immediate responses. And so do you. You can sit alone in a familiar room, afternoon light falling gently on the floor, your phone right beside you, but not picked up. Not because you are trying to appear strong, nor because you are practicing restraint, simply because inside, there is no more pull. No longer the feeling that you must check to know where you stand in someone else's heart. That quiet does not make you shrink. It gives you a sense of having a place to be, a space where you do not need to be on guard. Carl Jung once wrote that peace does not come from avoiding conflict, but from reconciling the opposites within. The state you are touching is not the kind of peace that comes from everything going smoothly or perfectly. It comes from the moment when the parts within you that once opposed each other, desire and fear, hope and defense, stop pulling you in different directions. They coexist, no longer canceling each other out. And in that coexistence, no one has to win and no one has to lose. In this state, you do not lose your emotions. You are still sad when sadness is needed, still happy when there is something to be happy about. But emotions are no longer sitting in the driver's seat. They no longer determine your direction. You feel them, but you no longer have to act immediately to soothe or control them. A natural pause appears between what happens and your response. A family member may say something that irritates you. In the past, you would react right away or hold it in while tensing up inside. But now, you notice the irritation, and you do not have to fix it immediately. You do not rush to justify yourself. You do not rush to push back. You let the feeling be there and realize it does not demand that you do anything at all. This change also shows up clearly at work. Some people used to be the ones always taking on extra responsibility, always staying later, always accepting more tasks when others hesitated. In the past, that gave them a sense of safety, a sense of having a place. When they stop pursuing recognition, they begin to realize they are no longer driven to prove themselves the way they were before. They still do well, but they do not work to be kept. And that, in itself, makes them lighter. A manager in a work team once shared with me that after many years of always stepping in to arrange things, solve problems, and take responsibility for the whole team, he suddenly realized he no longer had the reflex to jump in first. Not because he cared less, but because he no longer feared that if he did not do it, everything would collapse. He allowed others to step into that space, and that space did not cause the breakdown he had imagined. In personal relationships, the new state shows up in the way you no longer try to impress. You do not adjust your words to fit expectations. You do not stay silent just to be liked. You say what needs to be said and remain quiet when it feels complete. Your presence carries a different quality, steady and not demanding. Others sense this, not through words, but through how it feels to be near you. Attraction in this state does not come from effort. It comes from no longer needing to be chosen to feel you have value. When that need settles, you enter a connection with a different posture. You do not lean toward others to find support. You stand at your own center, and that itself creates a kind of connection that is not forced. A weekend with no plans, and you do not feel restless. An evening with no messages, and you still sleep well. A conversation that goes nowhere, and you do not need to extend it. Things that once made you uneasy now become manageable, enough to pass through. This new state also does not completely remove old sadness. From time to time, familiar feelings return. The difference lies in how you meet them. You do not rush to push them away, nor to label them. You let them be there, like a wave moving across the surface of a lake. You know they do not define you, and they do not need to lead you to any action. Living in this state long enough, you begin to trust your own rhythm. You no longer measure your worth through others' reactions. You do not need to constantly check where you stand in anyone's eyes. This brings a very quiet kind of freedom. Not the freedom to do everything, but freedom from the urge to do. You may realize that this state existed in you very early on, before you learned how to pursue, before you learned how to strain yourself to be kept. Now, as old movements settle, that state returns. Not intact as before, but enough for you to recognize you have been here once. So, when you are no longer pursuing, no longer clinging, does the state you are in now feel familiar? Or is it something you lost amid the constant movements of life? And now, for the first time, you are touching it again. Join the conversation in our comment section. We truly look forward to hearing your story. 7. Who will you become? There is no longer the feeling that you must take one more step to reach something. When the movement of pursuit has been still long enough, a once familiar question suddenly falls from your hands. The question of how to be loved is not answered in any dramatic way. It simply loses its central place in your inner life. Like a background sound that has been playing for many years, one day it suddenly turns off, and you only notice its existence when the silence appears. That disappearance does not create the emptiness you once imagined. It does not bring confusion or collapse. It is like putting down a heavy object you have held for too long. Your arm feels slightly numb at first, not yet used to the lightness. You realize you used to carry that question into every relationship, every choice, every moment of silence. It slipped into the way you spoke, the way you waited, the way you adjusted yourself. And now, when it is no longer there, you do not need to rush to find another question to replace it, nor to fill the space with a new goal. In the place the old question once occupied, a space appears. This space is hard to name because it has never been fully experienced. Before, that inner room was always filled by roles, by having to be someone in other people's eyes, by the desire to be recognized and kept. Now, as those layers withdraw, you stand before an undefined space. There are no clear instructions, no expectation to become anything. There is only your presence, for the first time not pulled back to a familiar question, and in that quiet, something very slow begins to form, not an answer, but the feeling of being able to remain with yourself without needing a reason. This space does not pull you down. It does not threaten your identity. It simply brings a strange feeling, as if you are present without yet needing to tell any story about yourself. You are not the one being chosen, nor do you need to become the one who chooses. You are there, whole within what has not yet been named. Many people who are used to living through a constantly active ego will find this stage uncomfortable. When the self that used to coordinate, control, and demand feedback and validation no longer occupies the center, you may feel as if you are fading, as though your presence is not as defined as before. This feeling can easily be mistaken for losing direction or losing value. But in truth, this is the first time you are not covered by familiar defensive movements. The layers of reaction that once helped you survive begin to settle, and in that quiet, you start to meet yourself at a deeper level, with fewer roles, fewer defenses. Carl Jung called this journey the process of individuation. He did not describe it as a path to become more outstanding or to build a new ideal image. On the contrary, he saw it as a return, a gradual withdrawal from borrowed patterns. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. This statement does not promise a brilliant ending, nor does it paint a picture of who you will become. It only affirms a direction, a very quiet one, a turning inward, where you do not need to perform or prove. In light of that idea, you may realize that for a long time, you have lived in response, a response to the expectations of family, of society, of close relationships. You adjusted yourself to fit, to be accepted, to avoid being left behind. As those responses gradually stop dominating, you do not need to rush to fill the space with a new identity. You can remain there a little longer, to feel yourself when you no longer have to answer to anyone. And in that slowness, a very real sense of self begins to emerge, not loud, but steady. You do not become a better version in the usual sense. You do not shine brighter, nor do you disappear. What changes is the degree of truth with which you allow yourself to be present. You express yourself less through templates. You no longer have to soothe others to stay safe. Compromises with fear lessen, and that naturally changes your presence. This change can be seen in very small situations. You say what you think without wrapping it up to be accepted. You end a relationship when you feel it is no longer aligned, and you do not need a long story to justify it. You choose to remain in quiet spaces you once avoided. In your family, you may notice you no longer play the role of peacemaker at all costs. You listen, but you do not absorb all of others' tension as before. You are present enough without losing your boundaries. As a result, relationships change, sometimes becoming more distant, sometimes deeper, but they no longer run on the old momentum. At work, this shift also happens quietly. You no longer build your self-worth entirely on performance or recognition. You work with a different focus. Less driven, career choices begin to reflect something true inside, rather than merely reacting to external pressure. A director who once needed to control every detail may realize he no longer needs to stand at the center of every decision. He leaves space for others to step in, not as a strategy, but because he no longer fears losing his role. That space, instead of making him fade, allows him to be more clearly present as a human being. What matters is that this stage does not promise results. There is no vision of an ideal relationship, a perfect life, or a neatly wrapped ending. When you change from within, the outer world begins to move in ways that cannot be predicted. Some things leave, some things come closer, and you do not need to control that rhythm. Real change does not happen like a leap. It is more like a shift in the center of gravity. Before, you lived to be chosen. Now, you live from an inner point of support. That support is not fixed, but steady enough that you no longer need to constantly seek validation. At this stage, you may feel you are in between what was familiar and what has not yet been named, between an old story and a presence that does not yet need a story. This state does not need to be resolved. It needs to be stayed with, long enough for you to realize you are not lost. When you no longer live to be chosen, no longer organize your life around other people's gaze, how will you begin to live? This question does not demand action. It simply opens a space for you to listen to what is slowly forming inside. Just continue to remain with the feeling you have, even if it is still vague, unclear, and allow it to speak what needs to be heard. By this point, you still might not feel that everything is clearer. There may be no neat answer, no bright moment of illumination that makes you certain you have understood, and that is completely normal. Deep transformations rarely appear in the form of a clear realization. They often unfold quietly, almost without being noticed. Real change usually begins with very small signs. A familiar thought that used to repeat over and over now suddenly appears less often. A reaction that once surfaced immediately now has an added beat of slowness. One time, you do not do the thing you always used to do. Not because you are trying, but because the urge is naturally no longer there. You do not have to change right after this video ends. You also do not have to fully believe everything you have just heard. Just let those things be there, like a seed resting in the soil, not needing to sprout yet, not needing special care. It only needs time and space. If there is a moment at some point in your day, something very ordinary, when you realize you are no longer as rushed as before, no longer needing to prove, no longer clinging to something familiar, then perhaps everything has already begun to shift in its own way. If you find this video helpful, do not forget to subscribe to the channel so you do not miss upcoming videos about the journey of understanding yourself and observing your inner life. Click the notification bell icon to be updated as soon as we release new videos. We always have interesting and useful content waiting for you. Thank you for watching, and see you again in the next videos.